Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with another in our series of Dave's Faves. And today, I want to tell you about my favorite recordings of the Brahms Serenades, numbers 1 and 2, because you can usually get them on one disc. And so I'm going to put them together on one disc. This is the disc that has both. I could do this again that way about performances where they show up separately. Oh my goodness, I love the Serenades. You know, when you listen to Brahms, you usually start out listening to things like, the violin concerto, the First Symphony, stuff like that, the piano quintet. But in the orchestral realm, there's not very much Brahms. There are 4 symphonies, 2 overtures, 1 set of variations, and the concertos. That's it. Not a lot. And I just remember being so shocked and surprised to discover that there are 2 orchestral serenades, big orchestral works, apart from the symphonies, that very few people play and that don't get much attention. And what's really interesting to me, once you hear them, is that they sound very different from the symphonies. They are earlier, but in some ways they sound better. I say that in a facetious way, of course, but the reason is because serenades are looser than symphonies. Of course, they don't have the same strictness. And so Brahms did not have, Beethoven up his butt when he was writing these 2 serenades. He wasn't worried about the tramp of a giant and Beethoven's 10th and all of that crap that we always hear when we talk about Brahms. The fact is that Brahms did have a very distinctive way of writing a symphony, and a very distinctive and rather austere view of handling of the orchestra when writing a symphony. For example, most of his symphonies, well, there are only 4 of them, but they begin with a main theme played by the strings. In the Second Symphony, it's a dialogue between the lower strings, the horns, and the woodwinds. So he wasn't dogmatic quite in that way. But the first big outburst, the first big tutti, is always going to be played by the strings. And the emphasis in sonority in his symphonies is always weighted toward the strings, with the winds and the brass as sort of appurtenances, extras. In the serenades, that's not true. In the serenade, first of all, the second serenade has no violins at all. And so it's all about the woodwind section. The first serenade as well, it begins with a beautiful horn solo, followed by a clarinet, followed by the trumpets getting the tune. I mean, you'll almost never hear a moment in a Brahms symphony where the trumpets get the tune. He just doesn't do it. He'll give a tune to the horns once in a while. But basically, the symphonies are very sober, and that sobriety is intentional. We know that from the serenades. We know that because Brahms didn't have to write that way. He doesn't write that way in the serenades. The serenades are the pieces where he learned how to write for the woodwind section in the orchestra. And oh my, how wonderfully he did it. It makes you wish he'd just done it more later on. I mean, it did with me, because when I first heard the symphonies, I was just shocked. I mean, the serenades, I was shocked. They sounded so open and fresh and lively compared to the rather sober symphonies. And the symphonies are there. They are sober and austere in their way. And you have to get used to that style. Brahms had his symphonic style. Now, I admire the fact that he had his symphonic style. I really do. You learn to understand what it is. But back when I was a callow youth and did not get it, I thought these serenades were just fabulous, and I wish he'd written a lot more of them. And they're gorgeous. They are absolutely beautiful, beautiful works. Big, long, maybe too long. The first serenade has like 6 movements and it lasts forever. It goes on for a while, especially this big long adagio in the middle. I mean, Brahms was writing without worry. And it's wonderful what he wrote without worry. He also wrote his first piano sonatas without worry. That's why we don't play them anymore. They're like these big, ungainly, multi-movement things. And so people think, well, he later tidied himself up and got stricter and all that stuff. And he did. He definitely did. But early Brahms is kind of a special field. And if you haven't heard the serenades, you really are in for a treat, because they are wholly lovely works, however long they may be. They've been recorded many, many times. Really a lot of times, and very well. There are many fine recordings. I've done talks on on both of them, I think. Well, I mean, particularly the first serenade. The second serenade I've included elsewhere for the most part. But the first serenade is really, really, I mean, it's a big, huge symphonic thing, which never gets done as well, at least as often as it should be done. And I kind of understand why, so it's all right. It's all right. I'd rather listen to it at home on records. And the performance that I want to listen to, because this is a Dave's fave, and I have to get to it eventually, is Haitink and the Concertgebouw. For both of them on one disc. I'm qualifying that because for the first serenade, I think the Czech Philharmonic with Bělohlavek on Superphone is equally marvelous. It really is. So for both serenades on one disc, I go with Haitink and the Concertgebouw because the playing is just astoundingly beautiful. They have one of the great woodwind sections in the history of the universe. Everybody plays with that easy, relaxed character that the music just demands, but there's energy at the climaxes. And Haitink, it's a perfect piece for Haitink because it doesn't require any great display of personality on the part of the conductor. It requires the conductor to focus on basic musical values, which he does. He does superbly well. He really does. And it is the most beautiful performance of the first serenade I've ever heard in my life. It is magnificently recorded. The sound is just, it's just to die for. It really, really is. The second serenade has that incredible woodwind section, you know, bubbling along through the whole thing, and the dark sonority of the lower strings, which is Haitink is really into. You know, these half tints and shades and somber shadows occasionally obscuring the general sunlight and all of that poetic falderall we use to discuss these works. They are magnificent. So if you want to get your serenades going, then I strongly recommend Haitink and the Concertgebouw for both of them, numbers 1 and 2. But at number 1, you put it on and you are just going to go, where has this music been all my life? And that's a very good question, because it's exactly what I asked when I first heard these serenades after slogging through the symphonies and thinking, gee, other people have orchestrated better. Why didn't Brahms do it? Then I hear this, and I said, he did. There we go. So keep on listening, friends. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.